Okay, well, welcome everyone. We are recording for the benefit of those who can't join us today or who joined late, and also for our own reflections. Welcome to the first Leading Greater Essex Plus Unplugged session. So the idea is that we're definitely trying to create a community of those of us who've taken part in Leading Greater Essex, which includes me as an alumnus of the 2022 cohort. And I've been coordinating some of the older LGE sessions, and now I'm in this sort of new learning space that we're creating. So, as most of you hopefully know, we've got a LinkedIn page where we're looking to connect with some people who want to do things online in that open free-form place where we can chat. We've also got the MS Teams site, which we know some of you who are non-ECC have some issues accessing, but we are still working on making that better for you. And if you'd like some one-to-one electronic support, we can show you how to get into sort of the slightly backdoor way into that if you haven't got a login that makes it easy. And we have the pleasure today of Gavin Jones as our guest speaker, fully unplugged, warts and all, being a disruptive systems leader, to tell us his thoughts about how organisations fail. I can trail today that I'm booking in approximately monthly sessions for LGE Plus of this nature. They won't all be twilight. We're intending some of them to be morning, sort of breakfast time, lunchtime, whatever seems to suit people to work flexibly. We like the idea of you joining as flexibly and electronically as you wish. So you could be camera off if you're traveling, or camera on if you can, so that Gavin can see your faces and know that who are people here. Gavin has said that he would like you to engage with the chat and stick your hand up if you want to engage in the conversation as it unfolds. And there'll be some more time for free form questions at the end when Gavin's sort of running out of steam and wants to take over and make it more interactive. So I will be here throughout. I am your host for all of the LG Plus Unplugged sessions, and Viv will be admitting you. We are live and recording, and hopefully some more colleagues will join us. Over 400 people are invited to today, because that's how many of us have either been through LGE so far, or who have engaged as sort of friends of LGE as sponsors and other systems leaders. So welcome all. And if you're ready, Gavin, over to you.
Kate, thank you very much indeed. And really good evening to everybody here. So as Kate says, I'm very happy to take questions interactively. I'm conscious that we've got some partners on here as well, so I'll try to steer clear of local government acronyms. But if I do say anything you're not sure about, don't hesitate to put your hand up or put something in the chat, and I'll pick it up in a moment. So I'm going to be covering quite a lot of first of all, what is a challenged council? What do we mean by that? What happens when they fail? Do they just disappear? When it does fail, often you'll find that commissioners are brought in, and I'm currently a commissioner. So as well as the Chief Executive at Essex, I'm also a commissioner at Thurrock Council, where I've been all day today, and I'm a commissioner at Slough Borough Council as well. So I'll talk a little bit about, so what are these commissioners? What are the powers they've got? What's the role that they have in trying to help the organisations recover? Then we'll have a little bit about, and this might hopefully generate some discussion, but so why do they fail? What are the common causes of failure? I think understanding that maybe helps us think about, okay, well, how do we stop that happening in the first place? What are those root causes? And then what does recovery look like? And actually, what is the ultimate for recovery? What is the implication to the residents, to staff, and to the council of an organisation that has failed in this way? So how do we define a challenged council? Well, I guess the definition today has changed since about 2015. And up until 2015, councils were reviewed by the Audit Commission in something called a CPA inspection, corporate performance assessment. And that tried to provide assurance to government effectively about whether a council was fit for purpose. And it looked at a whole series of things. It's quite an intensive process, actually. And as a result of that, you were given a star rating from literally 1 star to, I think, 4 stars. And although many of us didn't particularly enjoy the CPA process, because it was quite demanding, you'd have quite a lot of inspectors on site. Just from memory, I think it was at least a week, if not longer. But it did actually provide some assurance to government. And in fact, when I joined local government in 2005, I was at Swindon Borough Council, which at that time was one of the failing councils. Actually, CPA was quite helpful in holding the mirror to the organisation and providing clarity about where it needed to improve. But that all changed actually in 2015 when the then Secretary of State for Local Government, Eric Pickles, now Lord Pickles, scrapped the Audit Commission and with it CPA inspection. So suddenly there was no formal mechanism for what would be called a corporate peer challenge for local authorities, no formal quality assurance process. So out of that was born something called the Corporate Peer Challenge, which was run by the Local Government Association. But it was in many ways a very pale imitation of CPA. It relied on councils voluntarily taking from peers basically a challenge about how they were performing. And many authorities didn't take that offer up because it wasn't mandatory, it was optional. And actually, I think time has proven that there's a variable quality and standard of those peer inspections. So as a result, whereas back up to 2015, we could define those councils in trouble clearly by their star rating, requires improvement, weak, strong, so on and so forth. Really, the only mechanism we now have for determining a failing council actually is money. It's a fact, and most significantly, when a council suddenly finds it can't balance its books. Now, of course, legally, local authorities are not allowed to go bankrupt. That's just something we're not allowed to do. So when you get to a situation where essentially your income is insufficient to match your planned expenditure, the finance director, which we in local government called Section 151, has to declare something called a Section 114, which basically is a notice to say we can't balance our books. That then kicks off quite a process, to say the least. So I said that councils can't actually go bankrupt. When you declare a Section 114, that normally triggers a reaction from government. Three things actually tend to happen. The first thing is, of course, government want to know why you're declaring a 114. What's gone on in that council to not allow it to balance its books? Is it simply that actually they're well managed, but they don't have enough money to do all the things that they need to do? But in most cases, you find there are some underlying causes that have caused that problem that ultimately manifest as this problem of Section 114 that's declared, as I said, by the Section 151. I'm sorry for all these acronyms, but this is the world in which we have to live. When that happens, the government normally then commissions what's called a best value inspection, which is a very intense piece of work because it wants to know exactly what has gone on in that council to get it to this position. Because I don't know if many of you are familiar with those councils more recently that have found themselves in trouble, but you're talking probably about places like Croydon, Northamptonshire, Slough, Thurrock, Woking, and perhaps most significantly from the scale perspective, Birmingham as well. Each one of those councils that are now deemed as being a failing councils, there are slightly different root causes to what caused the problem. But the common feature, although the money is a manifestation of the problem, the issues in those local authorities were probably in play for many, many years. And we're going to explore some of those around some of those authorities and then hopefully create a discussion about it. See if you recognise any of those things in your own organisation. It's rarely one thing that causes a council a problem like that. It is normally a collection of failures within the organisation that ultimately lead to bad decision making or lack of decision making, which ultimately suddenly, when pressures of finance bear down on the council, they suddenly realise that they haven't taken the steps they should have taken many, many years ago, and it manifests as failure in that way as well. So I mentioned this thing called a best value inspection. So if you take Slough Borough Council, for example, which I think was more recently one of the biggest problem areas. So Slough has an annual budget. It's a small council, unitary council, of about 130 million a year. And that's very small. You compare that to Essex County, which I think grosses just over £1 billion. So it gives you a kind of size of the scale. But on that annual budget, they racked up effectively a potential debt of probably in the region of about £750 million. Quite a lot of money, I think you would agree. And why did that happen? So basically in Slough's case, their aim was to try, if any of you know Slough, it's not the most attractive town centre in the world, but it does have enormous high-tech industries on the Slough trading estate. Essentially, the council tried to regenerate the town centre by buying up lots of assets, but it did it very poorly, and many of the assets it bought were well overpriced for their actual market value. And then they suddenly felt themselves very exposed due to a whole series of accounting issues. So suddenly they had that position where they couldn't balance their budget anymore. At that point, when they went to government to declare the 114, the government then commissioned some inspectors to do a best value inspection. And a best value inspection can probably take up to about 6 weeks. And it involves a small team that will go through every aspect of the council. It will look at leadership, it will look at culture, it'll look at governance, it'll look about performance management, it'll look at accountability, and obviously it'll have a very detailed look at the financial picture. At the end of that process, a best value inspection report is created and it goes to the local government minister. And civil servants plough through it, they advise the minister, and at the end of that, in most cases, the minister will then declare that the council is under government intervention. Secretary of State has certain powers where he can insist that the council do things. And at that point, commissioners are appointed. So that's when people like me are appointed to effectively help the council recover, help the council understand why it failed, face up to its challenges, and help it to recover. That all sounds quite straightforward, doesn't it? But actually, it's very, very stressful for an organisation when they go into intervention. What you tend to find, first of all, is that the vast majority of staff never knew there was a problem. It just comes out of nowhere because it manifests as a finance issue. Because actually what we often find in these organisations is that power and decision making tends to be closed into a fairly small group of people, and the rest of the organisation, although they may feel it's not a great place to work, they have no idea that the council has found itself into this terrible situation. And that's exactly what happened at Slough, actually, and it's a shock to the organisation, and it's probably just as, if not a bigger shock, to the residents of that place, and creates an enormous amount of anger, because of course the implications of a council falling over is that that money that it's racked up, that debt, in this case Slough's racked up, the government are not going to bail them out. There are no bailouts in local government. That council has to be able to recover the money, pay it off, and I'll talk a little bit about how it does that and what happens. So you get a best value inspection, commissioners are appointed. Depending what the best value inspection has found, the Secretary of State will then write to the affected council with what's called as a set of directions, which is informed by the best value inspection. So it will say, it'll say these failures, we expect you to be able to recover in these areas, and we will assign commissioners and we will give them very specific powers that if you don't take the right decisions, the commissioners will take those decisions for you. And again, we'll explore that a little bit more. So commissioners are very empowered to make decisions if the council won't make them themselves. So the question I've just seen here from Sharon is increasing number of Section 114s recently. Can that in any way be attributed to losing the Audit Commission inspections or the funding structure for local authorities? So just unpacking that a little bit, I think you can absolutely attribute it in part, in my view, to the abolition of the Audit Commission, because it did provide a form of assurance. It wasn't foolproof, but it did, it was quite rigorous, and it did provide assurance. So I think that absolutely increased the risk of councils going unnoticed. And we'll talk about Thurrock in that context in a second. But we're starting to see now, and I think this is where I want to make a considerable distinction. The councils that I've mentioned there, the Croydons, the Northamptonshire, Slough, Thurrock, Woking and Birmingham, you can absolutely point to very poor practice, poor leadership, poor culture, poor governance, poor decision making in those authorities that cause the problem. But what we are beginning to see now is quite a number of authorities where there's no immediate evidence of poor decision making or poor running as a council, but actually the funding challenges that councils have endured for many years now, plus the enormous increasing demand in things like children's services, home to school transport, special educational needs, adult social care. Frankly, there just isn't enough money in the system for many of these authorities to be able to cope. And I think I'd put those councils in a slightly different category because that's where the money issue and government funding is really beginning to bite, I have to say. Again, happy to take questions around that. Sadly, I'm thinking 2024, you're going to see a lot more Section 114s. So I mentioned that the government doesn't pay off debt. So what happens to it? So if you take Slough's case, that's 650 million of debt that they accrued. How on earth do they pay that back if they've only got an annual budget of 130 million? Well, what happens when you do a 114 is that you then apply to government for what's called a capitalisation directive. I'm sorry, this is all a bit techie stuff, but to put it in simple terms, that debt is effectively turned into a loan that the council has to pay back over a period of time. It's a public works loan board rate, so it's relatively cheap in terms of interest, but you can imagine that amount of money can turn into a loan. But equally, the council is mandated. I'll come on to that, Hannah, in a second as to who the debtors are. It varies from different councils. I've just lost my train of thought there just for a second. The council is also expected to find many other ways to pay off that debt. Now, in Slough's case, I mentioned that actually part of the reason that they got themselves into trouble was that they went on a spending spree about buying all sorts of different assets in Slough. If you ever get a chance to go to Slough, they have got the most prestigious council building, which should tell you a story in part. They paid an absolute fortune for it. It is worth about 20% of what they paid for it, effectively. So part of what Slough has to do, it owns an awful lot of assets and they have to sell off most of those assets. Many of those assets are service-based assets, but nothing is sacred in the sense of how they have to deal with the debt. So they'll look at things like increasing fees and charges, they'll look at getting rid of assets to pay off that debt, and then there will be the loan. Now, again, just to give you an impact, a sense of the impact of when a council fails like that, it is truly seismic in terms of the long-term impact. Give you a sense of that. So we talked about Slough's 130 million a year budget. Typically for a local authority, borrowing is quite normal for any organisation. It's quite healthy to have a degree of borrowing. But in local government world, you shouldn't really go above about 10% max of your annual spend going on servicing debt. That's kind of considered to be a good sense of gearing. With Slough, because of the amount of debt they accrued, 35% of their annual income went to servicing debt. So if you think about that for a minute, before a single penny goes out on paying for services, in many cases for vulnerable people, 35% of their funding goes straight out the door paying off debt. And I think that gives you a sense why it is so catastrophic when these problems happen, because generations of people in Slough will not receive the level of service that they should expect from a local authority. So you'll often hear when a council goes into this position and there's a recovery plan, and we'll talk more about that, you hear this thing called new operating model. And we probably all use that term to a greater degree. What that really means in this case is how do they redesign their council to be able to do a lot less and do it much more efficiently and effective. And that's a massive ask. Intervention normally the minister will appoint 3 years as an intervention period. Slough is 2 years in, Thurrock is just over a year in. But the reality, the situation is so chronic in these authorities, it is almost certain that the intervention will last a lot longer than the 3 years. And if you look at Birmingham, for example, which has got a huge amount of debt to deal with, I think that intervention is for at least 5 years, but it will be a much, much longer than that there as well. So going on to Shami's point, is it fair to say that we'll likely see more 114s in some of our most deprived places? I think that is possible. And these are more the 114s that aren't related to very poorly run councils because of the funding issue, because increasingly local authorities rely on council tax to fund. That's become a bigger portion of our income stream. And of course, if you're in a poor deprived area where house prices are not particularly high in value and you have a lot of people that are exempt from paying council tax, it is inevitable that you can't raise as much money as, say, a rich place like Surrey, for example. So yes, Shami, that probably is quite likely, unfortunately. Robin's question, is the risk of council failure going to be a hindrance to future investment into local infrastructure? Yes, I think that is one of the direct consequences of when a council goes into 114. What I neglected to tell you is that the minute you declare a 114, all discretionary spending has to stop immediately. And much infrastructure work, of course, is discretionary. It's not mandatory stuff that you have to, statutory work that you have to do. So inevitably, a lot of the growth items which rely on infrastructure investment, those authorities will not be able to conduct that. They just won't have the money to do it. So, you know, there are real implications to people in place when these organisations get into trouble. Now, one of the questions I saw from Hannah was about, can you please explain who the debtors are, please? So, at Thurrock, so Slough I talked about, there were two reasons why Slough got into real trouble. One was, well, three actually. One was the spending spree on unwise investments, physical assets. They had a extremely poor Section 151 that frankly was culpable in terms of their lack of capability. So there was appalling financial practice. I won't go into the technical details when they're particularly interested in that, but you had somebody running the finance piece that frankly wasn't qualified to do it, for want of a better term. And then during lockdown, the then chief exec, who was dismissed by commissioners actually, did the most extraordinary reorganisation of the council. That basically put everybody on notice whilst they were all still in lockdown during COVID, and it completely destroyed the organisation. They worked with a consulting company that had never worked with local government before, didn't understand the thing about statutory roles, and it just created the most ridiculous confusion. When I went into Slough as a managing director commissioner, there was no CLT. There just wasn't anybody there at all. And that was a direct result of the most extraordinary restructure that then chief exec did as well. I'm sure I'm cheering you all up with this terrible stories of woe. So Richard Pulliston question about sometimes the councils, those with social care responsibilities, will struggle more than others. And do you think there is a way through these conundrums through transformation innovation? Yes, so Richard, certainly the pressures being felt by upper tier authorities around children's social care. You have a provider market in children's social care where the prices are just going through the roof. You wouldn't believe what it costs to place a child in some of these places. And the home to school transport and the special educational needs, their responsibilities are what we call the upper tier authority. So a county like us or a unitary authority. Districts aren't impacted by that, but of course they are impacted, particularly during a downturn where people aren't spending money maybe on car parking, leisure facilities. Theirs is a different kind of problem, but there's no doubt that the upper tier authorities, particularly at the moment, are the ones who are feeling very quickly the real pressure of financial drain as well. But again, what I'm trying to do through here is trying to make a distinction between those councils that are badly run, those that are really affected now by this issue around demand and money not meeting it. And then what's behind Richard's point is, but those authorities which are not badly run council necessarily, if they don't engage in a true transformation agenda where they're challenging every aspect of their organisation, it is true, in my view, that many of them simply will no longer be fit for purpose and go bust, for want of a better term, much earlier. And that's exactly why, by the way, being a bit parochial, why Essex has embarked on a whole council transformation. We run some great services. You probably know we've got outstanding in every category in children's services. But that can't be enough, because the challenges now are so acute. Even the very best organisations have to challenge themselves about could they be better? How can they be much more creative and innovative? But in that, there's a warning. So Northamptonshire was one of the authorities a few years back that got themselves into trouble. And that was actually about, they thought they had a silver bullet of what a modern council needed to look like. I can't remember the term they used for it. It was disastrous. It was beware of chief execs with silver bullets. It was absolutely awful, and it caused, in the end, the abolition of the council. So Northamptonshire County Council ceased to exist after that, and it's now broken up into 2 unitaries as well. Question from Kate about, are there other public sector partners at similar risk of this type of failure? Well, yes, I think all the public sector is under enormous stress. We've seen quite a lot of me around the police. I think it's West Midlands Police have just gone into special measures. I think I read that somewhere as well. Some of those organisations like health can sort of overspend in a year, whereas local government can't. Since we've had the kind of reduction in public sector funding, NHS and some other bodies have been given protected status. It may not feel like that if you're in NHS, but you're having a tough time. But local government is not a protected local government body. So we have, I think it's fair to say, taken a disproportionate amount of the savings over the years because we're not classed as a protected public body, and that has had huge impact for us as well. So yeah, we're doing good for time, so keep the questions coming in. I'll try and pick them up as you go along as well. So what are the type of things that cause these catastrophic failures then? Well, obviously the first place you look at is leadership. What's failed about the leadership, whether it be political leadership, chief officer leadership, or a combination of the two. And it's normally a combination of the two in my experience. And so what does it look like? Well, it can be one of its features can be about great hubris. We're the best at everything. Oh, we don't need to worry about that. We'll deal with it. We're fine. We see quite a lot of that. We create quite a lot of denial, if you like, a belief that everything is fine and they're making great decisions. You find leadership that is disconnected from the organisation. They don't communicate well. They don't engage properly with the organisation. They don't use their ears. They don't want to hear. You can't speak truth to power. They certainly disengage from the sector more generally, and they disengage from the communities that they serve. They are very early warning signs of an organisation that's getting itself into trouble. And they avoid difficult decisions. So if you take Thurrock, for example, again, I'm not revealing any secrets, it's all in the best value inspection reports. Thurrock thought they had the silver bullet. They did very little service redesign and transformation that many of us have had to do. Instead, they had a great wheeze that they invested in solar farms, and they used an independent broker to do that investment for them. And it worked for them for a little while, actually. It was generating a revenue stream. Then they overextended themselves on what's called short-term borrowing. And if you overextend yourself on short-term borrowing, suddenly the market loses confidence, which is what happened with Thurrock. And they borrowed from other local authorities, by the way. So local authorities do regularly do short-term borrowing between each other. Thurrock inappropriately basically borrowed far more than they should have had on short-term funding from other local authorities. Suddenly that got called in, and the council on a Friday afternoon had to phone the Treasury to say, you need to bail us out because we can't pay off our debts. Extraordinary, and you can only imagine the conversations that took place within government when they got that phone call, as you can imagine, I'm sure. And another aspect of leadership, if you look at Birmingham, why are they in such trouble? I mean, there's been no best value inspection yet, that's coming, but actually they've had equal pay issues in that authority for at least 15 years that I'm aware of, that they have manifestly failed to face up to the issue effectively for equality and fairness. And I think the figure is going up. I won't reveal what I know it to be at the moment, but the figure is going up in terms of the amount of debt that they have accrued, and it is huge. It'll be absolutely huge. Yeah, so Ben, your point about organisation failed, there seems to be a culture of secrecy around decision making. You're absolutely right. That is a common feature of all of these failing authorities. That sense of secrecy, complete lack of transparency, which of course translates into very poor governance. Because the one thing about local government, which I think is something we should be very proud of when it's working well, is that we have a really good route to decision making, and there we are with scrutiny, audit committee, constantly challenged to make sure we're making sound decisions. In those failing authorities, to every single one, poor governance was cited as one of the root causes, and that sense of secrecy, people over here making decisions. Again, I can tell you in Thurrock, so this was an officer problem, this part of it, is that there was a major infrastructure project that was going about 130 million overspend. Officers hid it from members. They hid it from members. Can you believe that? It's quite extraordinary. Great point by Sarah. So whilst ECC, yes, we might be in a good place. What can we learn from failed councils? Shed loads is the answer. So a lot of people say, well, how do you get the time to do Essex County Council and you do Thurrock and Slough? Well, I've got a great team around me, Richard Fullerton being one of them, that carry the strain in that regard. But actually, the councils see it at ECC as part of our commitment to learning, which is something I've always been very passionate since being here as chief exec for 8 years. That's why we set up Leading Greater Essex. I was one of the founders of setting that up, because actually you can learn from the best and you can learn from the worst. Yeah, even in the worst councils, there's some good practice that you can learn from, but as a way of holding the mirror to yourself, it's been invaluable. So we have conversations internally within CLT about what's the learning from some of these failed councils. And in some cases, you look at that and say, if we're not careful, we could find ourselves doing some of the things that we see in those councils as well. So it's really important that we do use it as a learning opportunity. Question from Robin, do we need the audit committee to return? I personally think we do need something, whether it's the government's kind of view to this is something called Offlog, which is very, very new. And it's going to start reporting on council performance, gathering all sorts of metrics and data. And as it does so, it plans to give the kind of metaphoric tap on the shoulder for a council where it's starting to see indicators that don't look quite right. Now, we don't know where Offlog will go. Will it morph into the audit commission? It's a long way from that at the moment. We don't know. And if there's a change of government, we don't yet know quite where a Labour government might go, although they seem to be quite in favour of some kind of better audit control. But I think our view is something needs to happen better than it's currently. There is another problem in our sector in local government, by the way. There is a crisis in external auditors. It seems not many people want to be auditors, so actually there is a huge backlog of signing off audited accounts. So if you look at Essex, really good authority, our accounts have not yet been signed off from last year. We've done everything we could have done, but the auditors just have not had the capacity, and that's a really big concern. And to be blunt, I think we as commissioners have concerns that is this being taken seriously enough by central government, because it is a major form of assurance, of course, external auditors. So other areas of root cause failures. Well, culture, obviously that's linked to leadership. We tend to find some pretty destructive cultures. It isn't safe to speak truth to power, and often there's no means of saying truth to power. We find a complete absence of accountability mechanisms, so no corporate performance reporting of progress, no appraisal system, that golden thread that starts from what are we trying to achieve as an organisation? How does that cascade through the organisation into performance and then regular appraisal processes? We find a very common symptom of these failing councils that stuff just doesn't exist, just not in place. Kate, once identified as a poor leader, what happens next with individuals? Okay, so this is a fascinating question. The previous minister, Lee Rowley, who's just changed that to become the housing minister. So we have a new minister for local government. We don't quite know what his key interests are, but he was very, very keen for civil servants to find a way of holding people more effectively to account. Now, if you look at Slough, there was accountability. The chief exec got fired by us as commissioners. No payoff, just fired. So there was accountability there, but there are, if I look at other authorities, chief exec of Thurrock resigned. There was no punitive measure against the chief executive. The harder area to pin accountability is on elected members, actually. And the argument obviously always is, well, ultimately the ballot box will determine that. And it did in Slough, actually. So if you look at Slough, been a very strong Labour-run authority for a very long period of time, huge majority. I think there were 5 Conservative councillors as opposition. One of the implications of when you go into intervention, and the minister is often minded to make you move to 4-year annual elections, because all of these councils I've spoken about have elections by 3rd every year, and then a fallow year on the 4th year. And normally what happens is the Secretary of State will make the move to all-out elections every 4 years. So that happened in Slough just this year, and that huge Labour majority and the leader of the council, who had the largest majority, lost his seat, and control suddenly switched to Conservative run on a minority administration. So you could argue that there is political accountability there, that he lost his seat and the party lost control of the council. But currently that really is the only mechanism. And it is another cause of concerns in these failing councils. That one of the other things, sounds like I'm having a go at Lord Pickles here. I don't intend to do that. But there used to be quite a strong standard set up in local authorities that if members were inappropriate in their roles, they could be taken to standards. And there were some quite punitive measures that could be taken at those councillors, and the most serious of which potentially is meaning you couldn't be a councillor anymore. That was abolished. That was abolished some years ago, and it is a source of great frustration, I think, for many authorities, that if you do get a councillor who is inappropriate, it's different if they break the law, by the way, that is inappropriate, the behaviour is appalling. Frankly, there are very few measures that organisation you can do against that member. If they're part of a political group, you tend to try to rely on that political group to keep them in play. But increasingly, we see in local authorities, many councillors are independents now, and non-aligned independents, and of course there is no party whipping system for them. So that is quite a problem, I have to say. Now, Paul, let's read your question here, Paul Mitchell. What is your view regarding changes in demographics in society, ageing populations, funding challenges? So I'm reading through. I'm sure you can all read these as well. Yeah, so this is about, I think there is one thing that is clear: closer working between the NHS and social care and councils more generally absolutely feels the right way ahead, especially as now the NHS through the ICSs have a broader set of strategic aims around economic growth, for example, which kind of align quite well with what local authorities do. But it feels very difficult because we are so culturally very different from each other, different in terms of conditions. My rather simplistic sense of the NHS, which is a national body and local governments are local, is that there are very different cultures, perhaps more command and control from the NHS from local authorities. And often we find, well, there are some pockets of great working and collaboration, it can sometimes feel very difficult to work effectively. And that's one of the reasons why we set up the LGE programme, actually, to try to create a greater sense of systems working. But I would like to see that change more and more. And, you know, there's a regular political debate about whether should social care just be transferred to the NHS. I don't think necessarily that's the right answer, because all you're doing is just transforming a structural problem. The problems around social care are around market and around spend and demand and ageing population, people living with multiple health needs more, NHS needing to get people out of the hospitals more quickly. And often we find in social care that they're not ready to go because we haven't been able to get the social care packages together. So it's a tough one, but I do think it's something, Paul, that really does need a focus on. So we've talked about culture, can't speak truth to power, doesn't feel safe, an inner cabal making decisions. That's definitely a symptom of all of these authorities, but in many cases, one of the hardest ones to fix and takes longer because cultures are so ingrained in the organisation. So one of the ways that you affect that quite quickly, and one of the consequences of being part of a leadership team that has failed in this way, in most cases, there has been an amazing churn of senior people, either being removed from the organisation or them leaving of their own volition as well. And that's not a bad thing at all, because, of course, when your leadership loses the trust and confidence of the staff, actually, it is very hard to win that back again. So probably better that you're not there, in my view. And actually, commissioners are part of our powers. When we go into intervention, we nearly always have the power of what's called, I mean, crudely, hire and fire at the top 3 levels of the organisation. Because the other thing, of course, is that when a council has failed, not only is the legitimacy of those leaders challenged, and that therefore probably they're not the right people to lead a recovery, but actually the skill set you need to recover and to take an organisation that's in desperate trouble and to help it recover at pace. And pace is the thing that the Secretary of State is constantly saying to us as commissioners and to that council. It requires a different skill set. And there are people out there that love the challenge of turning an organisation around. There's no shortage of them, but they are very different people from what I would call steady state, as a rule, steady state council. So you do see quite a change. So if I look at Slough, when I was the MD Commissioner there, hired a completely different leadership team. At Thurrock, we have Dave Smith, who is a managing director and a commissioner, doing a fantastic job, by the way. And we've completely redesigned the structure and brought lots of new people in with very different skills to that as well. And then we've talked a bit about governance, haven't we? About, you know, those committees that are meant to keep, you know, scrutiny committees, audit committee, totally dysfunctional. One of the things that surprised me, but one of the first things that I now look at when I do an intervention, is the quality of reports written by officers. Because, of course, the whole process of governance, of good decision making, of good scrutiny, starts from when a report is made to inform a decision that has to be made by a member. And I have been truly shocked by the appalling level quality of reports coming from officers in those failed authorities. You know, not giving members choices, not providing evidence, but opinions, and in many cases is what the officer wants to happen. So one of the first things that we have to do is, when we're trying to help a council recover, is to put officers through a big training program on how to write good quality reports. Sounds very basic, doesn't it? But it's, you know, if that's all you've been used to, and you've joined an organisation that doesn't put a lot of store in good quality reports, you can see why it becomes systemic in the organisation, becomes part of the culture in there. And maybe perhaps I didn't bring out clearly enough, you take Slough, that 2 years ago found itself into trouble. The problems in Slough go back at least 10 years. It was 10 years, if not more, in the making. And I think you'd say with Thurrock, probably even longer. It was for many, many years, the problems that I'm describing here existed in those organisations, but there was no proper mechanism of holding them to account for how they are operating. And they got away with it, to be blunt, because there was enough money in the system. But suddenly the money gets tighter, they make very risky decisions, bam, they're in trouble as well. So I've got quite a lot there. So just very briefly about recovery. So what does recovery look like? So commissioners oversee the recovery, but we expect the council to own it, whole councils. That's not just the administration. So there are two things that they have to pull together. One is a corporate improvement recovery plan, a very extensive programme, and the other one is a financial recovery plan. In a commissioning team, you'll typically have three commissioners. There's a lead commissioner. So I'm the lead commissioner at Slough and Thurrock. And each of those teams, I have a finance commissioner. So Nicole Wood, the finance director for Essex, is the finance commissioner for Thurrock. And a name some of you may recognise, Denise Murray, who used to work for Essex County Council, who is now the finance director of Bristol City Council, is the finance commissioner at Slough, and we also have an additional commissioner as well. And our role is to hold the council to account for delivering their improvement and recovery. Putting together a plan is relatively easy, but you've got to remember these councils are fairly decimated. By the time you get to the actually in there, they're pretty decimated. They're having to strip out costs, they're having to lay staff off. Many staff have left because the minute the news goes out that their council's failed, the good ones tend to go. So you are left with drawing up a plan, but then you've got to deliver it. And the depth of work that has to be done to deliver recovery is so huge, which is why I say actually 3 years for an intervention is never normally enough, because you cannot recover in the way that you need to. Now, Kate, you've asked me, please scroll back. There are a few questions from Sarah, Sharon and Robin that I think you skipped. Right, okay, so what have I missed? I thought I covered them all, but I haven't. Oh, right, this is from Sharon. What do you think of the Chancellor's autumn statement and potential impact on public services? So, moving on to the next question. There was some good news in there. The money going onto roads, potholes is sizable. I think it's a 10-year commitment they're giving for funding, much needed. I think the bit we were hoping for, particularly, was around children's and some of those demands that I've been speaking about, and it's been very silent on that, which is a really big problem. I think government absolutely recognise that this is a major issue for, as Richard put it, upper tier authorities. But to be blunt, it hasn't really contributed in the way that we hoped to try to help to deal with the issues that we've got. By the way, one of the other ways that many councils do balance their budgets, you'll hear this debate about a huge amount of reserves that council has. So that's just money in the bank, basically. And many councils have relied on reserves to balance their budget. Well, you can imagine the danger on that, because councils hold reserves to manage risk. But there's always risk in a budget. And clearly, if you're diving into reserves and not replenishing those reserves, your ability to cope with big problems, and big problems happen, big overspending projects, whatever it will be, your market prices go through the roof. If you haven't got good reserves, suddenly you find yourself into 114. And that's how quite a number of the more recent local authorities are finding themselves in trouble. They just don't have, they've used their reserves to be able to pay off their budgets. You must not systemically balance your budget every year by relying heavily on reserves. We have tipped into reserves in Essex on occasion, fairly modestly, but we always replenish those reserves afterwards. So, Kate, once identified as poor leader, what happens next to individuals? I think I've talked a little bit about that. It doesn't end well, I have to say, for most of them. And frankly, to be blunt, if you are abusing taxpayers' money by not providing the leadership you should, then there should be consequences, in my view, because unfortunately I see the carnage of when an authority goes into trouble like this. And it's awful for staff, many of whom live in the place that they serve. So you can imagine what it's like for them in their communities, having to face their communities. And what about the generations of children who get one childhood that won't get the services that they need or deserve because the council hasn't got the money to service them properly? I think that should have consequences. Oh, sorry, my Apple Watch has gone off. Right, here we go. Kate, I don't think I've missed any other questions from scrolling through here. I think I've covered them all, actually.
That's fine. I thought there were a couple, but I was just skipping back, and maybe you hadn't said
I haven't answered the debtors one. Yeah. So who did the people? Well, it's. I mean, it can be a myriad of them. I think the way I'd phrase it is that if I take Thurrock's case, so this is quite public. I think we're still trying to find where the money's gone in some cases. I can't put it any more strongly than that. But if I take Slough, for example, one of the first things you do when you do a best value inspection, obviously you're looking for, is there any criminality here? Have people been benefiting out of this, or is it a case of misuse of public funds, those kind of things? So if you look at places like Liverpool, that you've probably heard, there was certainly absolutely some cases to be answered a few years back about corruption by certain people. Won't go into more detail than that. At Slough, we found nothing. We had a really good look. There's no sense of corruption or personal gain, just incompetence, frankly. And Thurrock, well, I think the work is still going on to try and reclaim a lot of the money that was lost. Shall I pause there, Kate, and leave it wide open
very
for
much.
free fall?
I mean, it's fascinating for me, Gavin. I could just sit and chat to you about some of this because in my sort of private life, in my voluntary sector life, I run a very large charity as a trustee. And, you know, our reserves and our investments are very interesting to me. And obviously we have the opportunity to fundraise when things go wrong or when we need a bit more cash, we can sort of find something creative to do in that regard. But thank you very much. I think you've had a nice raft of questions, and I'd hope that the chat might even continue. So, you know, please, if you've got access to it after the event, anyone keep posted and keep talking. If you've got further thoughts that occur to you, on the way home or in the bath or wherever. Paul's heading off already. So I'd like to advertise that, as I said, this is the first one. This is an experiment. So we're really keen to have feedback from everybody who's been on the call today. Please don't just run away and say, thank you, bye. It would be lovely to say, you know, I liked this about it. I didn't like that about it. I'd like more of this or less of that. That would be a nice bit of open, unplugged viewer commentary as well. Gavin, similarly, you've done a wonderful job of juggling thinking, talking, reading, being on camera, all of which is not easy for any of us. So thank you for that. But tell us how you found it as a speaker.
When you said it was unplugged, I thought I could take my guitar, Kate, but obviously that wasn't the case.
Well, you
I
know,
misunderstood the
you could
message.
have arrived early and given us an intro, little bit of noodling as sort of the arrival lobby music. I can reveal that I have a lovely long list of suggested future speakers, partly generated by my attendance at the LGE 2023 celebration event, where I did a Slido with them all and asked them who they wanted. And they gave us some actual names and some types of people they'd like to hear from. Somebody very lovely said they'd like to hear from me, but I don't think it's going to be me in the early days. So I have got Susanna Howard of Suffolk and North East Essex Integrated Care Board coming along in early January. I can't tell you the date just yet because we're just tweaking the exact booking. Sorry, my text talking at me. So yes, watch this space for Susanna. But I'm trying to be quite creative. So we're going to have the people you've asked for, some of the people you haven't. We're going to have some people who've been quite creative in systems leadership in completely different sectors, nothing to do with Essex, nothing to do with public services, but who just are, I think, inspirational in what they've done or what they can talk about. I'm trying to get them all begged and borrowed and stolen. I'm not paying for any of them, so I'm not making inappropriate financial decisions, Gavin. Although I do wonder sometimes whether some poor leadership decision making is bad luck. That's maybe another question for another day. So thank you all for coming. Please do, as I say, keep engaging. This recording will be shared in the Microsoft Teams site that we have for LGE Plus. We'll also hopefully be having it as a live link on the LinkedIn LGE Plus space on YouTube. So that might be an easier connection for some of you who aren't within the ECC electronic estate. And let's keep it going. Please be as open and frank. If you have ideas, Gavin, you particularly as well, about who you'd like to hear from that hasn't already appeared on any of my lists, just dot it on a postcard, so to speak. And I'm hoping to continue to shape this space as we all, as the LGE family, want it to shape. So thank you all.
Thank you,
and thank
Kate.
you very much to Gavin. Enjoy your evenings. It's a horrible, grotty November day out there, but actually I've been looking forward to this all day and it's actually cheered me up no end after a pretty wet, miserable day with some frustrating governance to wrestle through. So, yes, well done, team, and see you all anon. Liv's going to
Thank
finish the
you,
recording.
everybody.
Thanks very much.